Live streaming.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our lunchtime conversation. I'm Rabbi Nicole Guzik. This is Dr. David Weinberg, and we are in a wonderful partnership today between the Sinai Temple Israel Center, Sinai Temple, and the Anti-Defamation League. So welcome, Dr. Weinberg. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I wanted to share a little bit about Dr. Weinberg and a little bit about his work at the ADL. Today we are speaking about anti-Semitism in the Middle Eastern governments. And let me tell you a little bit about our speaker this afternoon. David Weinberg is the Anti-Defamation League's Washington Director for International Affairs. That's where he is speaking from today, from the Maryland area. He serves as the organization's primary point of contact on foreign affairs issues for Congress, the administration, and foreign embassies. He's also the organization's lead analyst on government-enabled anti-Semitic incitement in the Middle East. Prior to joining ADL, Dr. Weinberg worked on Gulf issues as a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and as a professional staff member on Mideast issues at the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. David grew up in Los Angeles, began his study of Arabic at UCLA, and holds political science degrees from UC Berkeley and MIT. So welcome. I wish that you and I were speaking in person so that we could welcome you back to Los Angeles. So just for a few seconds, you grew up here in LA?
I grew up there in LA. My father grew up in your congregation. I'm a big fan and have spent many simchas there, and might even have some family on the line listening too. So hello to them, and also hello to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Fantastic.
Okay, so it's wonderful to have one of our own then, participating in the Sinai Temple program. I'm also a fellow Bruin, so it's nice to have that connection as well. And Dr. Weinberg, I'll let you take it away and share a little bit with us so everyone knows on the call who's watching. Dr. Weinberg will share some information with us, a brief lecture about anti-Semitism in Middle Eastern governments and countries, and then we'll have a chance to ask some follow-up questions. So thank you so much for enlightening us this afternoon and for being here today.
Great. All right, so I'm sharing my screen now. Hopefully you all are able to see it, and let's get into it. So what we're going to focus on today is anti-Semitic incitement that is state-enabled in the Middle East. So what do I mean by that? I mean things that are either directly propagated by a government. So for instance, if a government publishes a textbook that is anti-Semitic, or something that it indirectly enables, such as if it encourages or sponsors, say, a speaker who is known to be anti-Semitic, for example. And although I'm not talking specifically about incitement to violence per se, talking about incitement to hatred, which obviously through dehumanization of the other, demonization of Jews and the Jewish state, ultimately clears the way for violence in many instances as well. Now, a lot of people get hung up on semantics about, oh, well, if something's derogatory, is it towards Jews or Judaism or Israel or Zionism, and sort of splitting hairs in that regard. And what I find working on Mideast issues is that those distinctions are usually not pertinent because they all just sort of get slandered altogether. I also want to caution people that some of the content we'll be talking about today is hurtful or offensive or upsetting, and I want to recognize that and acknowledge it. So, one example of these distinctions just sort of being trampled over or disregarded or irrelevant. So this cartoon, this is a horrifying, offensive cartoon that I just pulled the other day off of Iran's government broadcasting website. And it's a cartoon that depicts President Trump riding a cruel-looking, monstrous snake. He's holding a sign that in Farsi says the American embassy, so it's a reference to the US moving its embassy to Jerusalem. And this monstrous snake with the Star of David on it is devouring the Temple Mount as well as the Gaza Strip. So this is an instance where, you know, if we were to really get hung up on distinctions about, well, does the cartoonist mean to be referring to Jews with the Star of David, or is it Zionism, or is it the Israeli government? I really think that's sort of beside the point here, right? It's demonizing the Jewish state in a way that I think is pretty clearly anti-Semitic, regardless of what the cartoonist's specific intention may have been. I also want to highlight something that we're not going to be really diving into in detail, just to sort of clarify, although it's certainly pertinent. In particular, we're not looking at levels of anti-Semitic incidents, although I think such incitement certainly fuels those sorts of incidents ultimately. And we're not specifically focusing as the object of study on levels of anti-Semitic attitudes. However, there's certainly a connection between those, right? So incitement can lead to increasing levels of belief in these sorts of anti-Semitic slanders or beliefs. And they can also create, those sorts of attitudes can create a ready environment in which such incitement may be more likely to happen. So, Nicole, I think you're muted.
I am muted. I was just going to say, for those who are watching, if they have questions throughout, I want to welcome you to put your question out on YouTube or Facebook, to write it in the chat, and I'll make sure to hold on to your question and ask the question at the end of the presentation.
Wonderful, thank you. And I definitely invite those questions. Would love to spend a lot of time on that at the end. So ADL conducted a poll in 2014 of levels of anti-Semitic beliefs in over 100 countries around the world, as well as in the territories of the West Bank and Gaza. The main thing that we focused on was levels of belief in anti-Semitic stereotypes in that poll. And perhaps unsurprisingly, all of the highest levels were in Middle Eastern countries. For instance, we tested, we asked people whether they agreed with 11 different statements that we know to be anti-Semitic stereotypes that are slanderous generalizations. And we graded each country by the percentage of respondents who agreed with at least a majority of those statements. And in the Middle East, it was an average of 74% of respondents agreed with the majority of anti-Semitic slanders and stereotypes that we had asked them about. In some countries, even higher than that. We also asked respondents whether they would agree with the statement, "A lot of people I know have negative feelings about Jews," and we also got that same high number of 74%. Now, in many instances, these levels of beliefs among the general public track very closely with what their government may be doing. And in some instances, they're not really directly in alignment. So one of the particularly striking cases is Iran. Now, Iran's government has been labeled this year by the US as the world's, not just the world's #1 state sponsor of terror, but the world's largest state sponsor of anti-Semitism, a position that the ADL agrees with. That having been said, surprisingly, of all the Muslim majority Middle Eastern countries that we polled in 2014, and again, we followed up in 2015, Iran actually had the lowest level of public belief among the people in anti-Semitic stereotypes, even as the government was on a daily basis both propagating and exporting horrific anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence. So the level of at which the public agreed with these stereotypes was 60%, which is still disturbingly high. It's just within the context of Middle Eastern public opinion, a little bit lower than some of the other cases. You know, one of the things the Iranian government has notoriously done, here's a cartoon from the Iranian government-sponsored Holocaust denial political cartoon contest in past years. Just, you know, really, really atrocious stuff with the full enthusiastic promotion of the Iranian government. Now, a lot of this has to do with messages directly from the top of the Iranian government. So here's an image of Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei, as well as some of his language that he was actually criticized for earlier this year regarding the current global pandemic. Now, unsurprisingly, with regard to the pandemic, the Iranian government, again, scapegoated Jews and others, baselessly blaming them for the crisis. Here's something he said that he was criticized for. The Persian says, there are some enemies of, and he's implying of the Iranian Republic here, who are genies, who are demons, and others who are human, and they cooperate together. And lo and behold, we did some digging and found on his website, he elaborated on the website, not in the speech, but in the website. What did he mean? He meant Jews. He was alleging that Jews were using evil magic to cause disease in Iran. You know, it would be funny if it wasn't so horrific. Similarly, we saw a number of other conspiracy theories about Jews in the pandemic from the Iranian government. And the Iranian health ministry at a time when really it should have been focusing on trying to halt the pandemic and help its people. Ironically, was sponsoring another one of these offensive cartoon contests just this year. It was specifically on the subject of the pandemic. And I did some digging and you know, perhaps unsurprisingly found this image and a number of other just, you know, deeply, deeply anti-Semitic, hateful images promoted by Iran's health ministry at a time when it really should have been focused on much more important things. This sort of incitement happens really at the youngest levels as well, in ways that will no doubt impact public levels of acceptance of these sorts of stereotypes, you know, increasingly over time, I expect, as probably has already to some degree. So for instance, this is an image of a government organized rally in Iran earlier this year protesting the US military action that killed Iran's lead terror sponsor, Qasem Soleimani. So at this rally, there's a boy holding a sign saying, "A new generation of Soleimanis will soon arrive. We love fighting against the Zionists. We will kill the Jews," which of course leaves out the fact that not only has Iran had a long-standing historic Jewish community, but that it claims to treat the rights of its own Jewish community equally, which is clearly not the case. But this is this sort of obvious incitement is government enabled. Additionally, this is the last Iran image I'm going to focus on here. This is a passage I found, or a quote and an image in an Iranian government textbook for elementary schoolers. And it shows Iran's previous supreme leader, Khomeini, along with one of his quotes, saying that Israel must be wiped out. We're going to move on to a number of other country cases, and we'll move through them a lot quicker than this one, but that one. But let's move on to Turkey, the other main country in the Middle East that is Muslim majority, but does have a notable remaining Jewish community. Even again, a Jewish community that is smaller than it used to be and beleaguered by its government. So we found earlier this year that while Turkey's government detained hundreds of critics for what it termed harmful disinformation related to the pandemic, pro-government actors in Turkey who were baselessly scapegoating Jews in Israel for the health crisis, including in major media outlets, of course faced no such penalty from the authorities. By the way, this number, the 71%, is the level in Turkey at which respondents agreed with the majority of the anti-Semitic stereotypes we had previously polled them on. And then here is a graphic It's in Turkish, so no worries about translating it if you don't want, if you're not inclined to do so. But what it is it's a bar chart showing aggregate levels of hate speech against various groups in Turkey. I believe this was 2018 calendar year, the most recent one for which full statistics are available, showing which groups were discriminated against through this hate speech. And unsurprisingly, the very top one here, Yahudiler, can probably guess, means Jews. Saudi Arabia is the next really notable country on this list at 74%. And here is the cover of a study that we at ADL released about a year and a half ago. I sat down with Saudi state textbooks for children and flipped through them a lot and found some really disturbing things. And these are government written, government published textbooks for use in government schools. So the three passages on the cover of that report that you can see here, if you're able to see the graphic, are encouraging domestic violence, calling Christianity invalid and perverted, and saying the goals of Zionism include the global Jewish government to control the entire world. And there was a lot of other awful anti-Semitic stuff in that report that we noted as well. Also here, the other main notable case in Saudi Arabia that I want to flag for people's awareness, the Saudi government ran a state book fair in the last year in the city of Jeddah, where we found, I think it was over a dozen different editions of Hitler's Mein Kampf being promoted by private exhibitors at that state-run event. So let's run through a couple more countries here, and then I'll talk about some positive developments amidst the frustrating, awful stuff, and also share some constructive resources in case they're of interest. So Egypt is one of the countries in the region that has a peace treaty with Israel. And yet, unfortunately, we found that the government's state-run TV channel, Channel 2, which is their main cultural television channel, had for years been running a talk show supposed to be focused on legitimate issues related to Egypt and Israel, but instead was really a platform for some of the, really all of the worst anti-Semitic stereotypes you could imagine. This disturbing image here is from the cover of an edition in Arabic published in Egypt of the notorious anti-Semitic hoax, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, something that has its origins in Europe and was transplanted into the Middle East and is quite popular in many of these places. Not only was this book published in Egypt in violation of that country's hate speech laws, but there was a signing of this book at the Cairo State-Run Book Fair at the beginning of this year. In Lebanon, so there's a great deal of anti-Semitic incitement as well, less so directly from the central government than from the terrorist group Hezbollah and its allies, with government facilitation indirectly. Also notably, this fellow here is the Speaker of Lebanon's parliament. Within weeks of meeting with a prominent Jewish American, Elliot Engel, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, this Lebanese parliamentary leader gave an interview to a Hezbollah newspaper in which he told a truly disgusting Jewish joke. He said he was being asked about politics and Israel and Jews, and he decided to go on a digression and say, hey, do you know how to find a Jewish person? And he elaborated, he said, you hold gold in front of the belly of a pregnant woman. And if a fetus reaches out and grabs that gold, you have the Jew. There's just absolutely disgusting messages from the very top of Lebanon's parliament. We at ADL also did a deep dive this year into textbooks generated for public and some private schools by the terrorist group Hezbollah for use in Lebanon. And here's one of the passages that we found. It's a grandfather giving his grandson a lesson about the 7th century and developments in Arabia that are relevant to Islamic history. And he said, "So let us take the lesson that the Zionists are the enemies of humanity in the past, present, and future." And again, because when he's talking about past here, he's not talking about like Herzl on forward. He's talking about 7th century Mizrahi Jews. And he says about the Jews, and this is because of their characteristics: deceit, treason, treachery, and breaking of pacts. So again, this is from a private organization, from a terrorist group, but it's being permitted by the Lebanese government, including in some public schools, allegedly. The UAE is a country in the Gulf that actually is pursuing some very constructive things in some ways, vis-a-vis Israel and vis-a-vis Jews. Although our poll in 2014 found 80% agreement with stereotypes among the public. One notable development or trend in the UAE that had been problematic for a long time, although seems to hopefully be changing, is a state-run religious event called the Dubai International Holy Quran Award, where notorious hate preachers year after year were given a platform, even if they weren't specifically inciting from that particular dais. So for example, this was a preacher who had a known record of saying that God should destroy the Jews at that event, and then being allowed to speak at that event in the future. Additionally, this is a book from the Abu Dhabi state-run book fair from a private exhibitor at that event. And it's a book about the Talmud, saying that the Talmud is the most dangerous book against Abrahamic religions, and it's behind a scandal of Jews trying to dominate the world. So clearly slandering Jews as well as the Jewish religion here. Qatar is a significant Gulf country that with similar levels of agreement with these stereotypes. This is an anti-Semitic book that we found at a Qatari state book fair. This is one of the most, this is an image from the Qatari state-run Grand Mosque, a sermon a couple of years ago where one of the two main preachers there said that the Jews killed the prophets, tried to kill Jesus, tried to kill Muhammad, and there's enmity towards you in their blood and in their veins. And then the last two country cases here, Jordan, another country that has a peace treaty with Israel. So this is an image from Jordanian state TV, Channel 1. And it's a parliamentary chairperson speaking there earlier this year saying, "I dare any lawyer, engineer, or doctor to even say hello to a Jew." It's an image helpfully translated by the Middle East Media Research Institute, one of the resources that we think is really helpful on these issues. And then here's an image from a Jordanian government textbook for children that claims the Zionist movement is a political, racist, colonial movement aimed at establishing a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine based on baseless historical claims. And then just the last country, or rather polity or society case here, the Palestinian Authority government in the territories of the West Bank and Hamas and Gaza. So this is an image of Mahmoud Abbas, the PA president, that his office put out a couple years ago when there were rumors that that he had gone to the hospital and died. So to show that he was alive and well, they sent a photo of him in the hospital reading the PA official newspaper with a political cartoon on back showing and demonizing IDF soldiers, showing them taking a bottle out of the mouth of a baby and replacing it with poison. Really a recycling of the age-old blood libel against Jews. And then here's an image from the textbooks. I think it's a third grade textbook published by Abbas's government and actually used in the Gaza Strip as well with Hamas's approval because it's plenty anti-Semitic and they're comfortable with that, even though they're not the ones who published it. So this PA textbook, it has a poem here saying in the voice of a student, "I swear to sacrifice with my blood and soak the earth of my generous people. I will expel the usurpers from my country, and I will annihilate the remnants of the foreigners." Really, really disturbing language that is truly unacceptable. Now, now that I've sufficiently, I think, brought us all down, I do want to talk about some positive developments. So part of that is removing bad content, right? And part of that also is trying to encourage positive content as well. So one of the things that we try and do is we try and bring this information to light with press, but also with government officials in order to make sure that they have the most up-to-date information on these issues so they can weigh in as well. So for instance, this book from Qatar's main book fair, state-run book fair, we exposed it, I believe it was a year and a half ago, and we wrote to the US Embassy to try and get them to weigh in, and they did, and they followed up, as did we. And at Qatar's most recent state book fair earlier this year, virtually all the anti-Semitic books were gone. And there had been a lot of them the previous time. Now, Qatar's government continues to incite anti-Semitism in lots of other inexcusable ways that still need to be addressed, but this was one narrow dimension in which something positive, or at least something bad, was reduced significantly. This hate preacher at the who was allowed to speak numerous times at the Dubai International Holy Quran Award, along with others, have since been banned from that event after we brought it up numerous times, including directly with the UAE government. And in fact, that festival has, at least as of last year, banned all lectures by hate preachers, and hopefully, and didn't have any this year either, and hopefully we'll stick with that in the future. And then that report that we had on Saudi state textbooks, the books are still really problematic. There's still a lot of really offensive and anti-Semitic stuff in there. But some of the things we flagged were removed in the last year. And all three of them that we flagged on the cover of our report have been eliminated. We're continuing to build pressure on the Saudis and to inform US officials so they know that the books are still bad and that they aren't sort of duped into thinking they've been fixed. But that's a positive trend. Also, one other positive thing about a problematic thing being removed, hopefully, that Egyptian state TV show, we're still monitoring it, but it tentatively looks like it may have been canceled in recent weeks. I do want to note some positive developments as well, good content. So for example, this is the King of Morocco in the last year visiting with the Jewish community in the town of Essaouira and encouraging coexistence with Jews, something his government has done a better job on than some of the other governments in the region. This image here it's a projected layout of what a new facility in Abu Dhabi is expected to look like in 2 years, called the Abrahamic Faith House, that the UAE government is building in coordination with Pope Francis. And those three buildings that you see there are intended to be built to be a synagogue, a mosque, and a church, specifically with programming aimed at facilitating interfaith solidarity among the Abrahamic religions. I'll also warn those of you at Temple Sinai, this is supposed to be one of the nicest synagogues built in the modern world, so y'all may have some run for your, some competition there in the Middle East in this one. And then lastly, I want to also acknowledge there was a historic delegation organized by the AJC this year to Auschwitz, in which a senior Saudi official brought together a number of Muslim faith leaders from around the world for the highest level Muslim faith delegation to a Nazi death camp in history. Also just want to put up a couple of resources here on the screen, and I'll leave them up here in case it's useful, and then we can just open it up to Q&A. So some resources that may be helpful for things you can do if you're interested. So obviously, speaking up against anti-Semitism is important. It's something that your congregation does a lot of and is very experienced at and engaged in. One resource that might be useful on this, if it's of interest, we posted a guide on our website, specifically at antisemitism.adl.org. That is a guide to explaining specifically 7 key anti-Semitic tropes and how some useful talking points in case it's helpful to flag sort of the origins of these tropes and why they can be dangerous. It's also important to flag anti-Semitic incidents when you encounter them. So, for example, if you encounter cyber hate that is anti-Semitic, you can have an impact by reporting it directly to the social media platform or website where you encounter it. We have a cyber safety action guide with a lot of the links for directly getting you to where you report this stuff if you encounter it, for example, on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or things like that. If there is a physical world anti-Semitic incident that that's brought to your attention, you can report it on our website at this address. I'd also encourage you to make sure that your congregation leaders are aware of it, which they may or may, they may already be. Also, in many instances, it's important to inform local law enforcement. Additionally, if there are international real-world incidents that come to your attention, I know this is a community where people have a lot of international awareness and attentiveness and often know foreign languages as well. This is my email address. Please feel free to reach out and notify me about these things. And it's also important to engage policymakers. So at a general level, simply just relaying to legislators or executive officials that you feel it's important that anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incitement be addressed as a concern by the US government is helpful. Additionally, there are two particular bipartisan bills in Congress right now that are really thoughtful and appropriate on these issues, specifically with regard to Saudi Arabia and the Palestinian Authority. Neither of the California senators are on these bills yet, although I imagine they would be amenable to it. And also none of the California members of the House of Representatives are co-sponsors on either of these bills yet, except I think Norma Torres from Riverside is on one, and Brad Sherman from your neck of the woods on the other side of the hill is on both, and he's actually a leader on the PA one. And then just getting involved, if you'd like to get involved with the LA office of ADL, here's a useful link for that, as well as a link if you'd like to receive subject-specific newsletters from us, either on international affairs or on other topics. So now that I have talked all of your ears off, thank you for taking the time to do this, and let's do some Q&A and let's have a conversation if that can be helpful.
Great. Thank you so much. An incredible amount of information and resources, and just grateful to you for your time and your expertise. I'm getting a lot of questions about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And so,
Sure.
Especially with this resource page, as you mentioned, speak up against anti-Semitism. Maybe you can speak a little bit to the point of when you see anti-Zionism, how does that get reported? We often speak about at Sinai Temple, often that when you see anti-Zionism, we see that as a direct link. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Yeah. And so what do people do in terms of reporting or getting the ADL involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So our CEO has stated quite directly, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's holding the Jewish people to a different standard than all other people. And if Norway and Sweden and America and Mexico want to merge into single countries, maybe then we can consider the idea of whether a binational one-state solution in the Middle East makes sense. But until people are really, until that's the standard everyone is held to, it's the crossover there is pretty clear. And obviously criticism of any government's particular policy can be appropriate, right? But to say that no criticism of Israel or of that no criticism of Israel could be anti-Semitic would be also outrageous, right? And so one of the 7 tropes of anti-Semitism on our guide, really is specifically on this issue with lots of detail and resources in case that's helpful.
Thank you. And so you can find that right there at this website, antisemitism.adl.org. You'll find that information about anti-Zionism. Perfect. Thank you. I'm actually really curious about the textbooks.
Yeah.
And what I'm wondering a few things. I'm wondering, when you showed the page of, and I saw that the retraction of the Saudi textbook, where exactly is that found? Do you have to, I have kind of a few questions in terms of that. Do you have to dig for it? I mean, do you have to be someone who's so well informed in terms of the language, and or is that so prevalent that it's easy to find? Number one. Number two, is it in a particular subject? Is it always in history? Is it in geography, religion? Where do you find that?
Yeah.
And then, okay, I'll stay there. How about that so far? How about textbooks? And then I have another question related to school.
Yeah. So I think the people who really dig into this are a little obsessed. But given that there are a number of us who work on these issues and reports we put out every couple of years where we're able to build on each other's work. So part of how I got started on that is looking at what reports have been written, and then the next year you go back to that page and you see, is it still there or is it not? The accessibility is a real challenge though. So with the Hezbollah textbooks, they were not online. We got them from anti-Hezbollah activists in hard copy. The Saudi ones are all online. For a time, they were all password protected. I asked a senior Saudi official for a password, and he declined to provide it. The Qataris had some similarly offensive content in their books that we and Memory exposed last year. So what did they do? They took those two books off the website.
Right, okay.
But as far as I'm aware, they're still teaching them. So it's
exactly, okay.
Yeah. And as for subjects, a lot of the stuff happens in religion textbooks with really selective versions of religious history or religious doctrine to play up a negative spin on sort of historical doctrine about Jews. A lot of it will happen in social studies and history textbooks, giving a really twisted view of history. But some of it is on stuff that's totally unrelated topics. So like, I've seen things like teaching children letters with militant words, or physics questions or math questions with violence against Israel.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, you do this deep dive into the textbooks and the curriculum, but I'm curious, is there any flagging of teachers? And is that even possible? You have the textbooks on one hand, but as we know, it's often the teacher that's the greatest, influencer in the classroom.
Yeah, so this is one of the biggest challenges about dealing with this on an international level. The textbooks are sort of, they should be low-hanging fruit, right? Because they're written down, they have a stamp of a government on them, they're supposedly being reviewed. And so they're easier for us on the outside to monitor and try and respond to. But it's much harder to really do the work in a classroom, in a school district, and so on, really with the accountability. And part of that, these governments spend a lot of money on sort of modernizing teacher training, but they're almost never focused on eliminating the anti-Semitism as one of those priorities.
Right. I'm gonna also send you a question that maybe you can look at, but in the meantime, I also want to ask you a little bit about the BDS movement.
Please, yeah.
Just if you can kind of, that's good. If you can clarify a little bit, how worried should we be about BDS? For years, that's been kind of the curriculum here in the US for our high school students to be aware of when they get to college campus. The But in terms of the Middle Eastern governments, how does BDS come into the picture?
Yeah. So a number of Middle Eastern governments that are anti-Israel and spreading anti-Semitism do support BDS in the United States, or more often in Europe. But they're not really the main driver of it per se, right?
Mm-hmm.
The issue of BDS is in some sense new and in some sense not new, right? I mean, when 20, was it 20 years ago, 15 years ago, something like that, when I was a college student in California, BDS was an issue. They weren't calling it BDS, but it was petitions to divest from Israel. And one of the ways in which BDS is frightening and hateful and harmful is often these campaigns demonize Israel and hold it to a different standard than any other country. They also frequently call for a one-state solution outcome that would eliminate the Jewish state, right? And subject its inhabitants to, real serious danger. With regard to sort of how BDS ties in with these Middle Eastern governments, a lot of these sort of most extreme BDS activists are especially close to the governments of Qatar or Turkey. And so that's one area I think of concern as well from my perspective. On the plus side, I do think that some of the, I think there's reasons to be concerned about BDS, and I also think it's less successful maybe than some of its advocates suggest.
Right.
So for example, there was a vote in the House that ADL and a broad array of Jewish communal groups and pro-Israel groups endorsed. We endorsed it both in the House and in the Senate, and it passed the House, I think it was 398 to like 20, something like that, saying that BDS is dangerous and harmful and not supported. And in terms of actual concrete harm to Israel's economy, I mean, in the time that BDS has become particularly prominent, the Israeli economy has done fantastically compared to other economies around the world. But it's really I think it's most alarming with regard to the fact that the BDS movement is often the primary vehicle through which efforts to delegitimize and demonize Israel are channeled.
And I think to that point, yeah, take a look if you, I mean, it might actually fit into this question. To that point, I think often students, young professionals, adults have a difficult time, especially when it's channeled in that particular way, speaking, giving a voice for Israel and trying to figure out how to stand up for Israel when it feels like maybe the criticism, as we were talking about before, we're not sure if the criticism is anti-Zionistic or anti-Semitic. So maybe, I don't know if that speaks a little bit to
totally. Yeah. I also want to address the question that you sent me from one of the watchers. So this is from, I think, Jerry. Wrote, I understand the concept that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. However, what is Zionism for this purpose? Would Judah Magnus be an anti-Semite for this purpose? I find it difficult when arguing with Jewish anti-Zionists that their views bear anti-Semitic. If I'm reading that correctly, can you provide more color on this point when confronted with this question? Yeah, so I think the main criticism of when we point out anti-Semitic expressions of anti-Semitism that are in the form of anti-Zionism. When a Jewish person says that they want a one-state solution, or that they don't support the state of Israel, that it can't be anti-Semitic, No, I think it's important to keep in mind, when someone says that they're anti-Zionist today, it's very different from somebody like Judah Magnus and his views about Zionism and his views about a one-state solution. Because somebody who calls for a one-state solution today is calling for the elimination of the state of Israel as it exists.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm also curious, you and I spoke about this yesterday for a few moments, but which countries do you see as the influencers? And can you point to those relationships between particular countries, meaning, Iran's anti-Semitic propaganda, which country outside of the Middle East might you see that, would you see that propaganda being distributed? Does that make sense?
Sure. So if I understand correctly, in what ways do we see this sort of anti-Semitic government propaganda from the Middle East, sort of being exported?
And what other countries, maybe that we would not necessarily suspect, which ones are opening their arms to that information?
Definitely. So I think some of the most notable ones in that regard are Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. So Iran's government has foreign language propaganda outlets in English, in Spanish, in French, in the Afghan language of Dari, in a lot in Arabic, in Turkish as well, and they spread this stuff really, really far and wide, and it gets picked up elsewhere. Turkey and Qatar provide a base for Muslim Brotherhood extremists spreading anti-Semitic messages, including to people who adhere to similar ideologies in other countries. I apologize, I've got someone making noise outside, but and then Saudi Arabia, as custodian of the two holiest sites in Islam, has a great degree of religious legitimacy among some audiences, and historically has played a really problematic role with exporting anti-Semitic messages that they're hopefully starting to turn around, but it's really mixed. One place, with regard to Qatar, for example, they've notoriously been called 300 people in a television station, because it's a country with a very small population that's home to, I believe, what's still the most popular satellite station in the Arabic-speaking world, Al Jazeera, which is a thoroughly, in my view, anti-Semitic outlet, at least in their Arabic content, whereas their English language content is a little bit more polished.
But are there particular countries outside of the Middle East? I'm just curious. You'd be surprised, but we're seeing this here.
Yeah, so it shows up in different parts of the world in different ways. So, for example, in Pakistan, a lot of Saudi religious indoctrination took root over the years. Same with Indonesia and Malaysia. Iran was able to spread a lot of its messages into Afghanistan. Some of the Hezbollah propaganda has shown up in some Latin American countries, as well as some Middle Eastern countries too. And there's a lot of the stuff that makes its way to Europe too. So, for example, Saudi state textbooks have been used in some religious schools in Europe, although for the most part they've been eliminated in most places.
Wow. I know they're asking us about the noise, but it's not your fault.
Sorry about that.
No. I want to ask one more question, and then David, if you have any other follow-up, that would be great. And if there are any other questions, please feel free, YouTube and Facebook, to ask. Otherwise, I saw, and maybe we'll put that resource page up in a few more moments with Dr. Weinberg's information, which I just so appreciate your willingness to be. Thank you so much, to be a resource to this community. But like you, I like to end on some kind of positive note. So maybe you can speak to that idea of signs of success a little bit more, and how about which countries we should follow for those signs of success? you know, I thought it was fascinating, as you mentioned, in terms of the you know, the taking out of some of those pieces in the textbooks, the Saudi textbook, and in terms of where was that main conference that you were speaking about? Was that in Qatar? Is that what you said before?
Which one?
The main conference where you said that they would no longer have any.
Oh yeah, the state book fair in Qatar. Yeah.
Exactly. Any other signs of success we should be keeping our eyes open for, or countries of note that we should watch?
Absolutely. So I'll share three encouraging signs with you here. So one of them is the increasing alignment of some moderate countries and governments in this region with Israel because of the threat that they face from Iran and Iranian-backed terrorist groups. Now,
so because of threats.
Right. This sort of common interest doesn't always translate into cutting out anti-Semitic incitement. And in fact, I've found that it continues in a lot of these places. But there is greater receptivity in those governments to changing that content if they're engaged directly on it and pushed repeatedly in public and private. And so I do think there's some positive developments there. The Antisemitism Guide resource, those 7 tropes and some of the examples from the Middle East, I actually gave I think it was a 2 or 3 hour briefing to senior officials in a Middle Eastern government on these things, and there was real interest in it. I think there is an open door in some parts of the Middle East to engaging with Jewish communities and to dispelling falsehoods. I also think there are some increasing places with increasing receptivity to grappling with the truly dismal levels of knowledge about the Holocaust in the region, which I think is a really central way to build empathy for Jews in Middle Eastern countries. So the 2014 ADL poll that I mentioned, in all of these Middle Eastern countries where we did the survey, not a single one broke 10% in terms of awareness of what is the Holocaust, or rather the questions were, have you heard of the Holocaust? And if so, do you believe that the number of Jews killed in it were accurately described by history and not a myth? Not exaggerated, not a myth. Less than 10%. But among elites, there is awareness of the Holocaust and the importance of teaching about it. So in Morocco, there is a civil society group of Muslim Moroccans who have been focused on raising awareness about Jewish culture and Jewish history there, who wrote a really superb book in Arabic on Holocaust education in coordination with the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. They're focus grouping it right now in individual schools, and I think there are good reasons to believe that it's going to get adopted in the entire public school system there. And hopefully it can be a model throughout the region and other parts of the Middle East to try and build empathy and understanding of the Jewish historical experience and who Jews are.
That's incredibly encouraging. And as you were speaking, you know, I was also just heartened to hear that you spoke for 2 to 3 hours about the anti-Semitic tropes and that the reception for that. And this is for a different conversation, but I'm just so curious how many Jews in America don't understand anti-Semitic tropes when they see it, or when with it, or when they speak it.
Yeah, we've got figures on that on our website from this year as well. We applied the same poll in the United States, and there's good news. It's nuanced there too. So I think it was actually misused by a celebrity this past week. The actually controversial Amazon series Hunters, about Nazi hunters. One of the stars in it was giving an interview, and he said 60% of Americans are anti-Semitic. That's wrong. And that was, I think, a misinterpretation of either our poll or one like it.
Oh, wow.
What we found were that, of the 11 stereotypes, some of them have a lot of people may believe, it was something like 60% may believe in 1 out of the 11, but generally don't believe in anti-Semitic stereotypes. But in terms of the national index score, it's low in the United States compared to the rest of the world, and it's been low for several decades. It's about 10%, which is still problematic and still
Right.
why we have educational programs and outreach. But even with the increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes in the United States, as well as in other countries, we're not finding increasing belief among the American public in anti-Semitic stereotypes. So I think that is definitely an encouraging sign.
Well, I'm certainly glad to hear that. Although I do think it would be an interesting follow-up lecture at some point for our community to receive that lecture,
Sure.
to learn, they may not necessarily be aware that they're witnessing an anti-Semitic trope when confronted with it. And getting that explanation and then learning more about how they can speak up against it.
Sure, I will. I'll send you the link for that in case it's helpful.
Thank you.
Well. Yeah,
Thank
with the
you.
specific tropes and what level people believe.
I appreciate that, and I just want to thank you. This was not only informative, it was helpful, and the small silver lining and blessing of the pandemic is that you and I can have a conversation from across the U.S. And that our community has a chance to learn from you in this particular way, and hopefully our virtual community worldwide has a chance to learn from you in this way. We're deeply grateful to you, Dr. Weinberg, and to the ADL, and I look forward to our partnership in the future.
Thanks so much for doing this, and thank you everybody for taking the time to engage on this.
Wonderful. Okay, have a wonderful day. And for those who would like more information, this particular lecture will be up on our YouTube page. And so you can find those resources there. Otherwise, go to the ADL website, or you can contact Sinai Temple, and I'm happy to connect you as well. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Weinberg.